Hello, friends. Welcome to Listening to the Verde, a series brought to you by Friends of the Verde River. This program will inspire, engage, and inform you about everything that makes the Verde River healthy: water flows, habitat, and community. I'm Tracy Stevens, Habitat Restoration Program Manager with Friends of the Verde River, and I'm here today with Janie, Agayos, wildlife biologist on the Red Rock Ranger District of the Coconino National Forest. We're here today to talk about the variety of rare wildlife species that rely on the habitat of the Verde River. Welcome, Janie. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and experience?
Sure. I am a wildlife biologist. I got a degree from Arizona State University a long time ago in fisheries and wildlife management. I began working with the Forest Service before I got my degree, and I started my training as a biologist like in 1990, 1991. And then when I graduated, I became a full-time professional biologist with the Forest Service. So I have been working on the Coconino National Forest for 27 years on the Red Rock Ranger District, and that is my district incorporates the Verde River, but also like Fossil, Oak Creek, Sycamore, West Clear, all those main perennial drainages that feed into the Verde. So for my job, the most of what my job entails is that I do environmental effects analysis on all projects that occur on National Forest lands, because we have so many rare listed species that need protection. So it's my job to do a proper disclosure to the public of the effects of projects on these rare species, but also really to try to mitigate these projects to remove as much of the effect as possible. So I do a lot of consultations with Fish and Wildlife on listed species, but then I also do a lot of habitat restoration projects and habitat protection. We have closure areas for certain critters, and I do a lot of environmental education. I really believe it's important to get the word out there and to share the knowledge. And I frankly think all of this is so fascinating. So I love getting out and talking about it.
That's great. You have such a diversity of experience and responsibilities, Janie. Can you talk a little bit about the different species that you work with over the course of the year? What surveys have you been doing recently?
Sure. So I do deal with all kinds of species and all taxa groups, including plants. So I deal with birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates, fish, and plants. And I also deal with non-native invasive plants and animals too. So I really think of myself, instead of a wildlife biologist, which tends to sound like I just work with mammals or birds. I tend to think of myself more as a naturalist, where I'm looking at everything as a whole and I'm dealing with everything. So it's really fascinating because I'm constantly learning. I mean, think of the invertebrates out there. We just discovered 2 new species of aquatic moths in Oak Creek last year that had never been described, never been named. And so there's so much to learn. It's a lifelong process.
That's really interesting that you just discovered two new species in Oak Creek.
And they could be in the Verde River. We don't even know, because we only only certain locations in Oak Creek were studied for them. So
you think that we know so much, and yet I still feel like there's so much to learn. Like you're saying, it's a lifelong process.
That's right.
So in working with all these different species, why is the river important for the different wildlife, and especially the rare species that you work with?
Well, there's so many of the species that I deal with. I deal with species that have been listed on the Endangered Species Act, but I also deal with other Act species like the Bald and Golden Eagle Act, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and then I also, with the Forest Service, we have our own list of what's called Forest Service sensitive species, and then I also coordinate with Arizona Game and Fish on their list of species of greater conservation need. So there's hundreds of species I deal with, and I have to parse my time out, and I tend to deal with the most critical species the most, and so for instance, for listed species, we have quite a few birds. We have the yellow-billed cuckoo, we have the southwestern willow flycatcher, we have the Mexican spotted owl that may not occur right down here in the Verde River and Verde Valley, but these riparian areas are corridors and dispersal corridors for them. Then we have like sensitive species like the common black hawk. We have sensitive amphibians such as the lowland leopard frog and Arizona toad. We have 2 listed garter snake species, the narrow-headed garter snake and the northern Mexican garter snake. We have 15 species of native fish, and of those, 13 have some kind of special status. 9 are listed under the Endangered Species Act, and 4 have like Forest Service sensitive status, and 2 are common enough that they don't have any special protection under any acts. We have invertebrates that are rare. We have 5 species of plants that occur in our riparian area. So our riparian areas are really diverse in terms of the vegetation, and of course aquatic species cannot persist without water, right? So if we didn't have the Verde River, we wouldn't have any of our aquatic species. But we also have all these riparian obligate species that they need the water, or they need the habitat, or they need both for all or part of, at least part of their life function. And 80% of Southwest species depend on riparian, but yet over historical time from Euro-American settlement to now, we've lost over 80% of our riparian width because of impacts. That started in the uplands and then exacerbated flooding and caused all kinds of changes to our geomorphology and our hydrology and how our rivers function. So that's why so many of our rare species are riparian species. I spend most of my time in quick dry pants because I'm doing surveys down in the riparian area. So yeah, so it's unfortunate, but it is so important, you know, the diversity of species, plant species and habitat, and the diversity of structure in riparian, from the ground cover to the mid-level story of vegetation to the overstory canopy of deciduous trees, to aquatic emergent vegetation, from floating vegetation on the water to submergent vegetation. All of it plays, all of it supports a critter, you know, and without all of it, we lose something, and we just don't want to lose too many of those things, or we're going to have an ecosystem that crashes.
Yeah, the water really is such an important factor.
That's right.
For all of us.
The water and the vegetation that the water supports, the riparian vegetation. So for sure, yeah, absolutely.
That diversity is so important. Now, we talked a little bit about all the different species you survey. What have you seen in population trends over time and in recent years for a lot of the species that you work with, these rare and important species?
In my career, we've actually seen 2 bird species come off the endangered species list, and that was really pretty exciting. And the whole intent of the Endangered Species Act is to protect things so that you can change what's threatening them so that they recover and become delisted. So those are bald eagle and peregrine falcon, and largely those 2 came off of the list because DDT was banned. You know, that caused the eggshell thinning, and just the weight of the birds caused the eggs to crack, and so there was no reproduction, no recruitment into the populations, and that's why those 2 species went on the list to begin with. And so we still do some protection for bald eagles around riparian areas where there's a lot of recreation, because even fishing line that's left in the creek can, or a fish hook that's left in a fish that has fishing line, can be taken by a bald eagle to the nest and get wrapped around the legs of the nestlings. So we still do a little bit of protection for bald eagles, and we do watch our peregrine sites just to make sure we don't have a lot of rock climbing activity or helicopter tours right near our sites. But for the most part, those 2 species are doing well and were removed from the list. However, we have other species that are still on the list and still need to be on the list. So willow flycatcher, interestingly, when I first started in the 90s on this district, was really, there were some populations, but those populations were blipping out. And part of that was because we had really big floods in '93 and again in 2005 that wiped out a lot of riparian vegetation. So we're in a period of good recovery of our riparian vegetation. And so in the last 5 years, I would say, it seems like surveyors are finding more willow flycatchers. Now, that's not to say that they're ready to be delisted, that there's enough of them to not worry about them, but it's better than it was in 97, 98, 99, the early 2000s. So flycatchers, for some reason, and I think it's recovery from those big floods, there seem to be on the uptick in our area, but they have a bigger range than just the Verde Valley, and they experience threats in other places of their range that we don't have. For instance, where they nest in pure monocultures of tamarisk, and that that introduced beetle is defoliating their only nesting habitat. Fortunately, we don't have that because of the work the Friends of the Verde River and the Verde Watershed Restoration crew are doing with removing our non-native introduced woody species. We don't have a lot of areas where it's an entire monostand of tamarisk that the flycatchers are forced to nest in. Our flycatchers get to nest in nice native vegetation. So if we do get that beetle that defoliates the tamarisk, it's not going to hurt our flycatchers here like it might in another area. So they're a little bit on the uptick in the Verde Valley. Cuckoos seem to be kind of holding steady or maybe slightly on the uptick, but cuckoos really need not only the riparian corridor and the riparian vegetation for nesting, but they need that immediate adjacent mesquite bosque or mesquite woodland upland for foraging for like cicadas and all kinds of beetles and different bugs. And so when the Verde Valley was settled, where settlers could farm and put their livestock without too much fear of flooding and threat of flooding was on those terraces with mesquite bosques, and they cleared them. So we've lost a lot of mesquite. So I feel like that's a big factor in the cuckoo decline in our area. Our narrowing of our riparian width, that's the statistic you hear about in the Southwest. Riparian areas have decreased by over 80%. So that's really in the width, like in our case in the Verde Valley. And that is because when we had Euro-American settlers come in the 1870s, 1880s, they brought livestock with them, and it was not regulated, and so there was severe overgrazing in the uplands. And when you take off all the grass and there's no leaf litter to land on the ground, there's no roots of that grass to hold the soil in place, the first rain event you get causes flooding. The old timers said that when they first came to the Verde Valley, the rain would be soaked up and it wouldn't even reach the dry washes. And then after grazing wiped off, slicked off all the grasses, the slightest little rain would cause the Verde River to flood. And that's because when you don't have anything on the ground, soil is hydrophobic. When it rains, the drops bounce. They don't soak into the ground. When you have vegetation, roots, and leaf litter, the old litter that has fallen to the ground, that slows down that hydrophobic action. It allows the water to seep in and then slowly infiltrate into the ground, and that's water that's not running off like water on a tin roof runs off real fast in a rainstorm. You want that water to infiltrate. So it would run off real fast. It would carry dirt and sediment with it. When it got to the dry washes, it was a lot of velocity, a lot of water, carrying boulders. When it got to the Verde River, our perennial streams, those trees, down trees, and huge boulders the size of vehicles, they were just carrying out riparian vegetation. So our channels went from broad valley floodplain, the Verde River was a broad valley floodplain, so flat and wide that you would cross it by jumping on clumps of grass, and instead it went to this incised channel because of all this excessive and exacerbated erosion from not having good uplands, not having good watershed conditions in the uplands. And so when we talk about our riparian width decreasing, it's mainly because of our incised channels. The water is down in this deep V, and the wetted area is so narrow, and there's not a hydrologic connectivity of the water to the floodplain anymore unless it's a big flood. And so for recruitment to occur of our deciduous riparian trees, they have to have their toes wet, So we're down to like this, narrow little width compared to historical conditions. So that's the cuckoo and the flycatcher. The cuckoo its problem is exacerbated because of the loss of the mesquite, because of agriculture and building homes and all that kind of stuff. We have the common black-hawk, which is not so common in its entire range. You see it often, but recruitment isn't very high, and they are having to feed on non-native prey. Like for instance, sometimes you'll see areas where black-hawks are feeding a lot on crayfish, and crayfish are non-native. Arizona does not have a native crayfish. Any crayfish in Arizona is non-native. And so these black-hawks, when they feed their babies little crops and the black-hawk adult crops for them to regurgitate food, has to be, work hard with the carapace of crayfish, whereas when they're feeding babies, native fish that are soft, non-spiny rayed, and they're feeding their babies native frogs and toads and tadpoles and things like that. That's so much easier for them to process, so less energy is expended in digesting that food. So crayfish aren't really an optimal food source for blackhawk. We can go on to all the taxa groups. You know, the other species that I deal with that I've seen changes in their distribution is like the narrow-headed garter snake used to occur all the way outside of Oak Creek Canyon, all the way down past Sedona, and now only occurs in the canyon. Wow. 20 years later, that change was detected. So big changes. Non-native fish are completely being devoured by non-native. Our native fish are being devoured by our non-native fish and outcompeted for space and habitat and that kind of thing. In Fossil Creek, when we restored Fossil Creek to a native fishery, the only fish that were left surviving in the middle section of Fossil Creek, where there were so many predaceous non-native bass and sunfish, green sunfish and smallmouth bass, were fish that were like 300 to 350, 400 millimeters, 16 inches. Mm-hmm. Everything else was gone in that section. Some of our native fish as adults don't even get past 45, 50 millimeters. So how would they ever have persisted with those non-native fish? So we've seen big declines in aquatic species populations too.
Janie, that's really interesting, what's happened to all of our species diversity and the impacts of non-natives. We're going to take a quick break and come back and talk a little bit more about the threats that these native, rare, and sensitive species face. Welcome back to Listening to the Verde. I'm here with Janie talking about rare wildlife species of the Verde River system. Now that we've spent some time discussing the variety of wildlife and some of the threats, we're going to talk more specifically about the challenges these species face. So Janie, you mentioned some of the changes you've seen in the river corridors. You talked about the changes to the riparian floodplain. Do you want to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the changes and challenges these species face?
Sure. So I think the number one threat to aquatic species in the Verde River or in anywhere in the Southwest is the introduction of non-native species. And I'm mainly a plant and animal species, but I'll talk about animals first. So our big non-native aquatic species that we deal with and that are really hard to deal with are bullfrogs, crayfish, and then in the Verde River we have over 20 species of non-native fish that sport fish and different fish that have been, some are aquarium fish that people feel like they're doing the right thing and they put their aquarium fish into the creek instead of taking it back to a pet store so the pet store can resell it. So though that introduction of non-native species has really decimated our aquatic species populations. Leopard frogs cannot persist with crayfish and non-native fish. They are just they're eaten. Not only, they themselves, are eaten. And so literally when we have a system with non-native, like either crayfish or bullfrogs or non-native fish, and sometimes we have all three groups in one system, these lowland leopard frogs blip out. So in the Verde Valley, we only have a handful, like maybe 5 tiny little populations where these lowland leopard frogs are persisting, and only because there's either some really good complex habitat that they're able to find hiding cover in, or they're just completely away from the main channel where they're able to persist where the non-natives aren't. Then Arizona toad is another native species that used to occur in the Verde Valley, and it no longer exists. We did 3 years of surveys over the last 3 years, and very extensive surveys all throughout the Verde Valley, including the headwaters of all of our streams, and we couldn't find any Arizona toads. And part of their decline is, interestingly, hybridization with another native toad, the woodhouse toad. So it's not a non-native in that case, but it's a native toad that thrives in irrigation, flooded areas, dammed water, ponded water. So in this Broad Valley floodplain, the woodhouse toad has taken over because we have so much agriculture and irrigation. And so they're a native species. They've just been opportunistic in their habitat selection, and they've done better, and they hybridized with Arizona toads. So over time, outcompeted and outswamped the genetics of the Arizona toad. So we've lost that species. So other species, those are some aquatic species. Our native fish, like I said, we have 15 species, of which 13 have some special status. Most of them are small little guys, small, some are only that big as adults, and they are totally eaten by bass and catfish, and there's so many species of non-natives that we have. We have non-native plant species that have taken over some of our areas, and those have changed the structure that have affected even aquatic species. So our floating water primrose, when you're kayaking down the Verde River at late in the summer, and you can't get through those sections where the primrose has choked out the entire width of the waterway. That's a non-native species, and that has changed the habitat for aquatic species. And then we have our riparian obligates, that have declined as well as a result of impacts to their habitat. So broadly, species become rare because of destruction of habitat. That's usually like the first and foremost. Like I've mentioned several times already, we've lost over 80% of our riparian width. So our species are starting at 20% of their potential, right? So they have 20% of their habitat left, and destruction of riparian vegetation or destruction of habitat can come in different forms. In the 50s, we were doing phreatophyte control in the Verde Valley, and that was where we thought if we just cut down all the trees that soaked up the water, any vegetation, cattails, trees, whatever, we would get more water to irrigate our crops. So phreatophyte control was a bad thing, and we learned that because it caused all kinds of problems with flooding. But even more, just even over-diverting water, more water than what's needed, that has an adverse effect. We want as much base flow in our creek in the driest, hottest parts of the summer, and our creeks do go way down from irrigation, and so making our ditches most efficient is really important. All kinds of threats. There's intentional things caused by people. For instance, people will fear snakes, and our narrow-headed garter snake does not look like a normal garter snake, and we have found them stoned to death, like crushed from being hit by rocks. Or people just handling them because they're interested in snakes overheats them, and they can die from overheating. So there's like intentional things. There's unintentional things, like when people plant these ornamentals that they don't realize are invasive, and then they get down into the national forest part of the riparian and spread up and down the river and overtake our native vegetation. That's like an unintentional consequence of just trying to make your property look nice, So all kinds of impacts. People can spread diseases and pathogens. If people are releasing aquarium fish into the river, those aquarium fish bring all kinds of bacteria, fungus, and just different fish diseases to the river. Lots of different ways that habitat's affected and how these species are affected. The main is habitat loss and also the introduction of non-native aquatic species and non-native plant species.
Sure. Yeah, it's amazing the impacts that these invasive species have had. One of the other things you mentioned was the Arizona toad. Are there other species that it's just too late for that we may have lost in the Verde?
Yeah, really good. Really good question. I mean, not really good that we have some as examples. So the first example, I think, is the best example because we used to have the southwestern river otter here in the Verde Valley in all of our perennial drainages. They're a predaceous little mammal that eat aquatic organisms, and the last one that I have ever heard of being detected in the Verde valley was up at Blue Hole in Sycamore Canyon by a colleague's grandfather in the 1930s, and that was probably the last one that was ever seen. Since then, in the 80s, Game and Fish introduced a subspecies of otter. So what we see in the Verde River now is not our native southwestern river otter, but a subspecies of a Louisiana subspecies of otter. So the southwestern river otter is forever gone. We have other species that we have used to have in this area. You know, we would have had jaguars. They used riparian corridors all the way up to the Grand Canyon. We have an endangered, or a fish. We had a native trout in Oak Creek Canyon that was lost well before it could be well documented. So we think it's the Gila trout, but it could have been a very endemic species, you know, to the Verde Valley.
Janie, you're so passionate about your work. It's great to hear you talk about this, and so informative. Why do you think it's important that the community members and people think, why is it important for us to conserve and learn about these wildlife species?
Well, as a biologist, I would say the reason I attune to the most is the ecological reason. You know, you think of every critter has its place, and there is a food chain, and when you interrupt that food chain, so macroinvertebrates in the water, they're food for fish and frogs and toads. If there's no macroinvertebrates, some of our fish species and our frogs and toads have nothing to eat. If our frogs and toads go away and our fish go away, then black hawks that eat fish or the garter snakes that eat fish go away. So there's an analogy to an airplane. If you take away a couple rivets in an airplane, the airplane can still fly. But eventually, if enough rivets are lost, the airplane's going to crash. You're going to lose a wing and it's going to crash. So that's like an ecosystem. You can only lose so much before you get, you know, pretty much absolute failure. So we never want to get to that point. But another good reason is for medicinal reasons. We have all kinds of species that have never been looked at for their medicinal values, but we do have some in the Southwest, like 3 species of native fish, and then our Gila monster. The Gila monster has been approved. Venom from the Gila monster is used in diabetes treatments, and that was approved by the FDA in 2004. And our native fish are being looked at for their supreme kidney function, and for their lack of sun cancer, you know, UV injuries from being right at the surface of the water, and for their excellent genomes. So, and then there's just, you know, cultural reasons, like we want to see different species in different areas. You know, you can go anywhere in the United States and catch a bass, a channel catfish, or a trout, but a rainbow trout. But when you come here, we have the Gila trout, or our chub in the river was called the Verde chub because it fights like a trout, but it's not even a trout. So our species make us unique, and we want to keep it that way.
I think that is a great point to end on, that we have all of these unique species and we want to keep it that way. Thanks so much, Janie, for joining us today. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. Thanks for watching this episode of Listening to the Verde with our special guest, Janie Agayos. To learn more about the topics we covered and watch more episodes of Listening to the Verde, please visit verderiver.org/listening.
Listening to the Verde is brought to you by Friends of the Verde River. Please visit verderiver.org/listening for more videos and resources.